Can you please give the panel an example of? How do you answer one of those questions in the medical interview process? Well, watch this video and you'll find out. Hi, I'm Anthony. I'm the career doctor. I make videos for other doctors to help with things like career challenges like the job application process. If you're finding this content helpful, I'd really ask that you subscribe and turn on notifications. Helps me out, but it also helps you to know when a new video is coming out. Also tell your friends about this content. So we're doing a series on the interview process and tackling some of those common scenarios that come up in the medical trainee interview. I'm actually on the road, so apologies for perhaps the lower quality of the video for today. But I thought we should look at the example-based questions. They are the questions where interviewers might ask something like, can you give us an example of, or in the past, how have you demonstrated? Those types of questions. They're very common in interviews. The reason they're common is based on the principle of past behaviour being a better predictor of future behaviour. So this is well known in the HR literature that such questions have a little bit more validity when it comes to the interview process. So we've talked a little bit about this framework in some of the other videos, particularly in relation to addressing things like selection criteria. But I just wanted to re-emphasise this process of the STAR framework because it is what good interview panels will be using to evaluate you against the selection criteria as well. They'll be looking to see that you can give examples that back up the actual selection criteria. So let's go through it again. What does STAR stand for? Well, STAR stands for situation. So when given an example, you need to give the situation that you were in. Task, so what were the tasks that you were asked to do or trying to achieve at the time. Actions, what actions did you undertake to address the issue or meet the challenge or whatever was happening in that example. And most importantly, result. I cannot emphasize enough that one of the big failings that I often see when trainee doctors are asked to give an example of something at the interview is that they're often very good at telling you what the situation and the task was and also what they did, their actions, but they fail to sell it. And they do so because they don't give you a clear understanding of what the result of all that action was. How did it make an impact? How did it positively change things for either the patient, the team, or just the person themselves? Sometimes the result is about something that you've learnt or grown through. So just remember the result. It's the most important part of the STAR framework, in my opinion, and the thing that's often missed out. So let's look at an example of how you might use this framework to answer an interview question. So here's a common question that maybe an intern or a resident might get for a job application, let's say for a general RMO, sort of PGY3 sort of role, or it could really happen in a range of other contexts to be fair. So the question might be based around a selection criteria of communication. Invariably, there's some sort of selection criteria around people's communication skills. And so the question might be, give an example of good communication in your work. Fairly obvious what's being asked for there. You need to come up with an example of how you have effectively communicated in your past work. So you could talk about how you communicate, what your preferences are. You could give examples of where there was a good success with the patient, that sort of stuff. But that's kind of an unstructured way of approaching it, and you do see that often. But if you're going to use the STAR framework, how might you approach this question? Well, here's a scenario I've made up, which I think would be a reasonable one that would, be authentic in a situation for some doctors. So in this case, the example that the trainee doctor is giving is around working in a general medical unit where there were patients with complex chronic medical conditions and English wasn't the first language for many of them. So situation, I've recently been working on a general medical unit where many of the patients have complex chronic medical conditions and are from non-English speaking backgrounds. It's always good to, in the situation bit, emphasize the complexity of the example or the challenge that you're going to give to the panel. So that's the situation. So what task were they asked to undertake? Well, the task needs to be relevant to the example that's required or being asked for. In this case, we're asking for something around communications. So they might say something like, my key communication task as the resident has been to communicate with the patients and their families about management and discharge plans. It's a very common task for a resident on a general medical unit. So, so far so good, describing the situation and the tasks, and this would be a common scenario that many residents might encounter, and panel would be understanding of it. So what sort of actions did they take to deal with that communication challenge? So the actions in this case: in order to ensure that I've been effectively communicating, I try to ensure that I have an interpreter present when I go through the discharge plans with patients and family. So that's the action that the residents take. And they go on. I always try to ring the patient's GP, but I particularly do so for patients where there have been significant communication challenges. It's interesting, when I talk to interns and residents these days, in my day we were trained to always ring the GP as the resident to make sure that communication occurred, and GPs were often very appreciative of getting a call from the hospital about their patients. I'm led to believe now, in a lot of situations, it's not as easy to get in contact with the GP, and sometimes the GPs might themselves prefer other modalities of contact. So it'd be reasonable to sort of say, I try to ring the GP, but in this case they're emphasising the fact that they do so when there's really a communication challenge, and they want to really emphasise the need for good follow-up and post-hospital care. So there's a couple of actions there. They make sure there's an interpreter available to help out with the communication, and that they're increasing their threshold for getting in contact with a GP for patients where English is a barrier. So that's great example, and you could probably stop there and the panel would be reasonably impressed with that approach. But has it made a difference? Has it benefited anyone in particular? Has all this extra effort gone anywhere? Well, this is where you really need to sell your examples. Now, I think this is where trainee doctors might get stuck a bit. They often feel like there isn't a tangible result, like you didn't decrease the bed stays or the rates of return to hospital or rates of falls or patient satisfaction surveys or whatever the issue might be. Look, sometimes you have examples of that where you've made a real sort of quantifiable impact, but often it's just a learning thing or a feedback thing, and that's actually okay. So here's the result in this situation. As a result, I've had many compliments from family members, and my consultant indicated that this was one of my strengths on my recent term appraisal. So there you go. Just could be a simple feedback compliment sort of thing. And that's a good result, good strong result to show that your actions have made a difference in the hospital. It also shows to the panel, though, that if you can talk about results, that you're the sort of person who wants to see whether your actions matter, that you want to measure your achievements, and you're interested in feedback yourself, and that shows a well-developed doctor. So there's an example of the STAR approach for answering a question where you might be specifically asked to give an example by the panel. As a final point, one thing I wanted to point out to you is that sometimes there are questions where they ask for examples of past behaviour. Sometimes there are other questions where they don't actually ask you for an example, but giving an example actually can be very useful and help your candidacy. So don't just limit the STAR approach to giving examples where you're actually specifically asked for one. Oftentimes, you might be given a situational question or a hypothetical question, like a clinical scenario, for example, where there might be a patient who's having an emergency situation, and you might have actually encountered something similar in the past. It doesn't have to be exactly the same, but something similar. So you can actually quite powerfully answer that question by saying something along the lines of, well, this is a common scenario and this is something I've actually encountered in the past when this happened. Then you give your STAR example. You might go back to answering the theoretical question. Or sometimes you might go through your approach to the situational question and then say something like, and actually I can give you an example of how I've actually dealt with a similar situation in the past. That's very powerful. That's a very powerful thing to do in an interview, in my opinion. As a panel member, I really appreciate it when trainee doctors go to the point of giving examples of how they've actually demonstrated that sort of thing in the past. And I think it's something that can really strengthen your candidacy. So don't forget, you can give examples when asked for them, but you can often also give examples even when they're not asked for, and that's okay in the interview. Hope that was helpful for you. See you again in another video in a week's time.